待会那个上 PPT 你教我啊，现在他也要大概10分钟1刻钟时间，他们讲话。
Okay, so we're allowing attendees in now. Okay. Good morning to you, colleagues. Welcome to this masterclass hosted by the National School of Government, which is a government department responsible for capacity building in the public sector in South Africa. It is great to have Professor Zhang Weiwei in this masterclass, which is our last masterclass for the year. It's great because of the wealth of experience that he's bringing into this conversation, which actually coincides with some of the key reforms that are taking place here in South Africa that are aimed at improving the capacity of the state. We have run a series of masterclasses before, and these have been very successful. Some of you have attended those masterclasses, which began last year. But first, because of who we are as a government department that provides training, and we're a department that self-funds partially, I must take a minute to market the National School of Government. As some of you are aware, we've got 4 faculties dealing with cadet and development. There's very junior employees in the public sector. The faculty dealing with middle management, those who are at senior in the professional development part, as well as executive leadership and support. The last faculty is very dynamic in a sense that typically you would have director general in it. You would also have a minister, a mayor, as well as a member of the board. So these are our faculties. We offer programs across, but also in addition, we do have cross-cutting training courses for elected and appointed officials. As we are all aware that the 6th administration took a decision that in this term of government, we must prioritize the issue of building a capable, ethical, and developmental state. You'll hear in some of the interventions that Prof. Zhang Weiwei will be making today, because he will be saying a lot about these 3 anchors of state reform, where the state must have the capacity, so there is a know-how. It must be ethical, which means the resources must be managed prudently, but also it must be developmental in a sense that the decisions and the program of government must impact in the lives of the people, and he will touch on that later on. As I've said, Prof. Zhang is closing the year of masterclasses this year. We had a successful masterclass, Prof. Zhang, earlier this year, which was attended by the president himself. He was a respondent, and Professor Mariano Mazzucato of the famous book, The Entrepreneurial State, was giving that masterclass. We've also had the Eric Lee, who is actually a senior fellow of the National School of Government, appointed last year. So from time to time, he leads leadership engagements here. And he was in dialogue with Dr. Cassius Lubisi, who is a former cabinet secretary and director general in the presidency. We've also engaged with futurist Peter Ho from Singapore, who's a fellow of the Civil Service College in Singapore, as well as the current Director General and Secretary of Cabinet in the presidency, Ms. Pindi Baleni. Last year, we had Eric Lee, in fact, as well. We've had Dr. Eddie Maloka and Triska from Kenya. And so we are growing. Some of these masterclasses are attended by well over 5,000, and people continue to listen to them beyond these conversations. We've engaged about the future of work. We've engaged about pandemics, where we're partnering with the GCIS. As the National School of Government, we've got flagship programs where we train, as I said, from the most junior up to the most senior. More recently, we are rolling out courses targeted at ministers, board members of SOEs, executives, mayors, and the municipal managers. And that is very key because you require the leadership. And the anchor, the theme of this conversation today, about the civilizing mission of meritocratic bureaucracies is about those people whom otherwise we could call, the mandarins, because this is the top leadership of the country that ought to be coming up with ideas, that ought to be breaking, a new ground in the type of programs that they implement in order to alleviate, poverty, inequality, and grow the economy. Our delivery modalities have changed because of the pandemic, and also for access purposes. We're largely doing courses through this platform. Now we have synchronous and asynchronous interventions, as well as face-to-face. And the beauty of using platforms like Zoom, as we are using now, is that we can have a professor from Fudan University, Prof. Zhang, coming into the NSG, engaging with the leadership of South Africa using a platform like this one. Of course, Professor Zhang, post the pandemic, we want to host you here in South Africa for a series of leadership conversation. As a National School of Government, we regard ourselves as a simulator. So we're making an argument that public servants, and in particular, senior public servants, must see themselves as pilots. And as you know, in aviation, to retain your license to fly, you must constantly return to the simulator. So the argument we're making is that just as you do in Shanghai at CLEP and other institutions, that here in South Africa, public sector leaders must return to the simulator to deepen their knowledge and also to master statecraft. By them joining this webinar today, they are doing exactly that. They are back in the simulator to engage with ideas. We say partnerships are the future. So Professor Zhang, hopefully we're gonna put Fudan University here soon as one of the partners. We already have a China National Academy of Governance, we've got China Africa Institute and the Civil Service College in Singapore, and many others in Europe and in America as well. Locally, we also work formally with these institutions that are shown here, and they are an arm, of states that is doing, capacity building for public sector, but also for society as a whole. Finally, we ask this question: where are the mandarins? This is an existential question for the bureaucracy in South Africa today, because we are constantly searching for committed, diligent, prudent, masterful, ethical and accountable, as well as innovative leaders in the public sector in order to take society forward. Without creating a caste system, it is not everybody who masters this in any administration. However, by creating a meritocratic system, you are able to provide support and identify those who can provide leadership. In one conversation, Professor Zhang, we were having with Professor Kishore, he put it to you in that conversation. He says, China succeeds because of government. India succeeds in spite of government. This is a question now to us as South Africans. as people who lead in the public sector to answer. Does the country succeed because of government, or the country succeeds in spite of government? And your insights today will be very valuable in this regard. As we say at the National School of Government, whether it's through this masterclass or through any other course that we offer, our aim is to help public servants to learn by expanding learning opportunities for them to master statecraft, to build the capacity and culture of public servants who can serve society effectively. And that lastly, they need to grow. This is the motto of the National School of Government. When you come through here, we say every public servant must learn in order to serve better, but also to grow professionally. So thank you very much once again, Prof. Zhang, for agreeing to be here. We look forward to a conversation with your good self. We will now give an opportunity to you. I'm sure you can share the presentation, and then afterwards, our esteemed colleagues will be giving a critique or a response into your intervention. Thank you, Prof. Zhang, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Director General. Your name is Ngawani. Thank you, Mr. Ngawani, for your very kind and warm introduction. And I will give you a presentation based on my own study. It will not be the views of the Chinese government or any institution, but my own research, and I would like to share these views with our friends in South Africa. I'm so glad and honored to have this opportunity to speak to the officials, senior civil servants, and to all the members of this National School of Government in South Africa. It's a great honor. And I will show a PowerPoint slides. At the same time, I will share my views with you. So now I will show my slides. So the very topic I've been asked to address today is the civilizational state and meritocracy experience from China. And let me first tell you a story. About 5 years ago, we had a meeting with Mr. Zakaria, as you know, CNN host. He asked me a rather sharp question. He said, look at Asia. Virtually all the countries, except China, have embraced Western political model. Why not China? And I said, in fact, the answer is not that complicated, because China's performance over the past 3 decades has been better than all the other Asian countries combined. So if there were a model, American model, Chinese model, I said, let 2 models compete with each other. So today, my presentation will more or less touch upon this theme as well. And it reminds me of my debate with the, as you know, Mr. Fukuyama, the author of The End of History and Last Man. As you know, his thesis is very simple. Western liberal democracy essentially represents the end of history, the best of model. All the other countries will gradually move towards that model. And when he came to China in the year 2011, there happened to be Arab Spring, when Egyptian leader Mubarak was toppled by the people of Egypt. So he said, China may also experience a kind of Arab Spring. I said, from my study of China and the Arab world, that will not happen in China. And I made a prediction. I said the Arab Spring will soon become Arab winter. Today, perhaps most people in Arabic countries have also shared this view. It has already become Arab winter. So many casualties, chaos, death, and whatever. So the consequence of that so-called Arab Spring lasts, but in most cases, negative, more negative than positive. And then we debated on this issue. He said that China needs to have a political reform, proceeding from his thesis of this end of history. Of course, China is awaiting a kind of color revolution and then embracing the American political model. I said, well, in fact, both China and the United States need political reforms. In fact, my feeling is the United States perhaps needs more political reforms than China. And I said, in fact, I have studied American political system. I came to a humble conclusion that your system is a product of pre-industrial era. It's really, to be frank, slightly outdated. It has to be reformed thoroughly. I made another forecast. I said, without substantial political reform, you will elect a leader worse off than George W. Bush. Yeah. In the end, he elected Donald Trump, good or bad. It's the people of the American people to decide. Then, of course, he said, he repeated his theme, end of history. I said, my conclusion is just opposite. It's not the end of history. It's the end of history. Each and every nation have the ability to find its own way forward, its own way of modernization in the light of its own national conditions. So the world will be very diverse. It's not the end of history. It's the end of history. So really, today, this exactly 10 years after this debate that took place in Shanghai, I think more or less we know who is on the right side of history. To be honest, I've just read a book written by two professors at Harvard University entitled How Democracies Die. They try to make an argument that is American democracy is more like democracy in third world countries. A typical feature of this is the loser will not accept its failure. Do not accept this. Of course, they are being very critical of Donald Trump. But we all remember this Capitol Hill, whatever you call it, on the 6th of July. It was stormed by so many people. I remember at that time there was a tweet which went viral worldwide. Of course, in China, the tweet says, if the United States saw what has happened here on the Capitol Hill, the US would invade and will invade the United States to liberate the United States from the tyranny of the United States. And they also have another tweet from a Brazilian diplomat in Washington. And he said that that's the first coup d'etat that took place in Americas without the participation of the American embassy. So these are the views of many other peoples looking at the United States and how its democracy has fared so far. Now, let's come to China. When I discuss China, let me give you some broad figures to illustrate how China has managed this kind of remarkable change and transformation. You look at the annual GDP growth rate, more or less around 8 to 9% a year over the past 4 decades and more. And with the annual trade growth rate around 14, 15%. And this year, it will be even higher. And China total GDP by the last year was $15.9 trillion, which means China was roughly 75% of the US economy, if you calculate this in US dollar terms, so-called nominal terms. Yet, if you use the purchasing power parity, so-called PPP, China was already an economy larger than the United States by the year 2014. So now 6-7 years have elapsed. So today's China economy by purchasing power parity would be $24.14 trillion, which is slightly, roughly 15% to 20% larger than the US economy measured by purchasing power parity. China is also now the largest trading nation with annual trade volume around $4.7 trillion last year. Now, what's most remarkable is China's poverty reduction, because you just provide indicators of growth rate, GDP. That's not important. That's important, but not that important. What's more important is the real living standards rising faster than anywhere in the world. And I was the other day, last week, chatting with a think tank in the United States. I said, look at China. We have eradicated 770 million poverty by a number of 770 million poor people have been lifted out of poverty. And this is Chinese official figure. If by UN figure, it's around 800 million. And in other words, more than 70% of the global poverty reduction had taken place in China. And since Xi Jinping came to power in the past 10 years, we lifted the last 90 million people, the last group of poor people out of poverty. We spent roughly $200 billion for that purpose in the last 10 years, 90 million people out of poverty. But you look at the US spending on the Afghan war, that was $2.26 trillion, 10 times more than what China has spent on poverty eradication. I said to my American friends, I said, look at this. If this $2.26 trillion was spent to wipe out global poverty, it's quite feasible, at least in theory. You have 10 times more money than China spent on eradicating poverty. So in theory, at least, we can eradicate the world poverty rather than cause so much destruction in the poor country, Afghanistan. This is really inhuman. It's a gross violation of human rights. And China has also produced the world's largest group of tourists, 150 million visits made abroad in the year 2019. What's more important, if you look at all the opinion surveys available, whether Ipsos, PW, Dahlia Research, you came to more or less same decision. Around 90% of Chinese population believe their country is on the right track. So that's very important. People think their country is on the right track. Now, what's more impressive is China's rise over the past 4 decades can be summarized in this way. I call it 4 industrial revolutions in one. That is roughly with every 10 years, Chinese experienced 1 industrial revolution. If we make analogy with the industrial revolution in European history, the first industrial revolution was marked by the United Kingdom, its textile industry. In the case of China, in the first decade of reform, indeed, China became the world's largest producer and trading nation for textiles. Then came the second industrial revolution. In European history, that was a power industry, power and electricity, power and power industry. In the case of China, by the year 2010, China became the world's largest producer of power generation. So China's power generation exceeds that of the United States. At the same time, the whole range of industries, manufacturing centers, they grow up. So China, by the year 2010, China also has become the world's largest manufacturing center. If we do not use the word industrial, developing countries, we use the word industrialized countries or agricultural countries or non-industrialized countries. So China, by the year 2010, became the world's largest industrialized country. And then the third revolution, that's the computer, internet, telecommunication revolution. Indeed, China was way behind in the year 1994, but it's moved up through the 2G, 3G, 4G. Now China is a leader, if not the leader, in 5G services. Then at the same time, the fourth revolution has started It has big data, AI technology, quantum communications, the list goes on. And at this moment, I think China and the United States are in the Premier League of that fourth industrial revolution. And personally, I think China is in a better position because many people say if oil is the resource for the previous industrial revolution, and the new industrial revolution, the key resource would be big data. And that's the case with the world today. And China, of course, given the size of the population, given the more extensive use of 4G, 5G telecommunications. So I think China generates more big data. So this is the situation. Now, here came an article I wrote almost exactly 15 years ago. I will spend a bit more time on that particular article I wrote for International Herald Tribune. Now it's part of the New York Times International Edition. In the year 2006, you may remember, China held its first China-African Forum at the level of summit. And on that particular event, more African leaders, heads of state and heads of government came to Beijing than for the African Union. So I wrote a short piece for this particular newspaper. I said, indeed, this has to do with the Chinese experience of development. I said, so many African leaders coming here for this summit, attracted not only by opportunities for aid and trade, but also by the Chinese model of development. And I argue that, only 3 decades ago, China was as poor as Malawi in terms of per capita GDP. Yet, China economy has expanded 9-fold by the year 2006. I think China model has in many ways challenged the conventional wisdom in the West on how to fight poverty and how to ensure good governance. So here's my discussion with you concerning the Chinese model of development and the governance. And in this article, I mentioned 6 aspects of Chinese model. Number 1 is people matter. I said since 1978, China has pursued a down-to-earth strategy for modernization, has focused on meeting the most pressing needs of the people. That's important. When I say people matter, today, Chinese leader Xi Jinping said people-centered development. Same message. So that's very important. It's people-centered. The American model I would call voter-centered. It's different. Look at the United States. We made a big data study analysis. In average, each general election, the attendance rate, turnout rate was roughly 55%. So a typical US president was elected by 51% out of this 55%. In other words, if 100 people can vote and only 55 people participate in the vote, and you have got only 27 or 29 of the votes, you got elected. So we call this voters-centered development. The Chinese case is people-centered, which means a vast majority of Chinese people. We follow the famous line from Chairman Deng Xiaoping. He said, seeking truth from facts. In other words, seeking truth from facts, not from dogmas, whether from the West or from the East. So each and every step of reform and change and development should take care of China's local conditions and should deliver tangible benefits to the people. So that's the feature number 1. Feature number 2 is constant experimentation. All changes in China first go through a process of trial and error on a small scale. Once they are proved working and they are extended elsewhere. That's very important because China is a huge country. It's a continent. So China's reform started with special economic zones. In these zones, we start 4 zones at first in early 1980s. In these zones, we tested all kinds of new methods. Some worked, some not working. And then we extend this experience elsewhere. So it's really pilot project based. And number 3 is a gradual reform, not a big bang. Because at that time, if you remember, that was during the time of Cold War. And Russia, the Soviet Union, adopted what's called the shock therapy. At that time, most people think shock therapy would be much better than China's gradual change. Yet, China have maintained this belief that we believe in gradual change, not a big bang theory. Gradually, even the institution have problems. We try to fix problems here and there, and gradually change them for the better, and then even transform them for the better. This is very important because, again, I will come to that concerning civilizational states. It's huge. The size of population is big, so you have to be cautious. If you look at China reform as a whole, usually easy reforms first, difficult ones second. Yeah, and then, as mentioned by the Director General, China has a developmental state. So China's change and transformation has been managed by a strong and pro-development state, which is capable of shaping national consensus on modernization, ensure overall political and macroeconomic stability. This is very important. In fact, when I look at Joe Biden, he used to be very critical of the Chinese way of development. Yet today, he is talking about, look at China, look at China, look at China. China has industrial policies, So United States is also adopting its industrial policies. For instance, big spending just adopted for infrastructure. So it's the kind of state intervention. Virtually in most countries, if not all, this element of the state has become far more important than before. Of course, that had to do with the spread of COVID-19, and that has reminded people the important role of the state. Otherwise, situation will become very chaotic. And they have a number 5 feature, which is selective learning. China has retained its tradition of selective cultural borrowing, including, learning a lot from the Western model, from the American model. For instance, China used to adopt the Soviet model, more or less Soviet model. We have a state planning. Then with reform, we shift to market economy. Of course, we call this socialist market economy. In other words, state still plays a very important role, especially in terms of industrial policy, in terms of experimentation, in terms of providing all kinds of strategic plans for the future. So this is important. Yet what's more important is in the whole process of learning, China has safeguarded its own policy space. In other words, no country can dictate China. China learns from others on its own initiative because we think it's good. We try to learn this from your side, and then we try to adapt this to China's own national conditions. This is very important. And lastly, you have a sense of sequence and priorities. If you look at China change over the past 4 decades, there's a clear pattern, easy reforms first, as I mentioned just now, difficult one second, rural changes first, urban one second, because the rural economy is less complicated. So changes started there. And once these changes have taken place, good results have achieved, then China moved to urban reforms, which are far more complicated. It has to do with banking, with financing, and with all types of industries. But then, of course, it's also necessary to reform. And China, large countries, we start with coastal areas first, because coastal areas are relatively more developed in terms of human resources, other conditions, and then move to interior provinces. Economic reform first, political one second. Again, economic reforms relatively easier, political reforms more complicated. So that's second stage. The advantage of this approach is, of course, you gain experience in the first stage, and then this experience can be applied in the second stage. In other words, China's transformation has been pursued in a very methodical way. It's not just a random idea and they just go ahead. It's really, in terms of methodology, it's rather sophisticated. So that's very important message as well. Then I made a point. I said, compared with the American model, I think Chinese model has been working better. And I explained, why the American model cannot work. I use Africa as an example. I said over the past 25 years, I traveled to over 100 countries, including 18 Africa. I made a conclusion that Chinese model, however imperfect, has worked far more effectively than what can be called the American model, as represented by the IMF designed structural adjustment program. When I was there in Africa, 15 years, 20 years back, this program was obviously failing everywhere. And it's a new liberalism, it's not working. Today, it's even not working there in the United States. That's why you have the Donald Trump phenomenon. Of course, also a failure of the shock therapy for Russia. This shock therapy was designed by professors from Harvard. And then I said, the American model is largely ideology-driven. They focus on mass democratization with little regard to local conditions. It treats sub-Saharan Africa or less developed economies as mature societies in which Western institutions will automatically take roots. In fact, at that time, my discussion of the American model and Chinese model is in the context of to what extent they may be useful for developing countries. If today I write this article again, I would say the American model at that time or today is even not working well for the American society, as I mentioned just now. Yeah, the United States is in trouble and the West is in trouble. The Western model as a whole is in trouble. One major problem is that model, Western model, American model included, is based on an assumption, which is faulty, that is rational human being assumption. One can cast a vote in a rational way, in a rational thinking, and then came rational results. This is shaky. Yeah. It had to do with not only whether psychological study, sociological study shows human beings may not be able to maintain always rational, plus the involvement of money, the evolution of AI technology. You have this kind of Cambridge Analytica, which sends whatever data you want, desired, etc. And then social media, the rise of social media. All this makes rational choice much, much more difficult. This is a huge challenge for the Western political model. To be honest, I think this model will decline and decline further. And then I said, in many developing countries, what they usually need is not a liberal democratic government, but a good government capable of fighting poverty and delivering basic services and basic security. And then I said, so long as the American model remains unable to deliver the desired outcome, as shown so clearly in the failures from Haiti to the Philippines to Iraq, the Chinese model will become more appealing to the world's poor. Then I began to quote Chairman Deng Xiaoping when he met with the leader of Ghana, Chairman Rawlings. I was his interpreter in 1985. And Deng Xiaoping said, please do not copy our model. If there is any experience on our part, it is to formulate policies in the light of your own national conditions. But that's a key message from Chinese experience and from the Chinese leadership. And then I said, perhaps attitudes makes all the difference. China is viewed by others as more modest, America as more arrogant, and China leads by example. America leads by lectures and sanctions, if not missiles. So that's probably the US model. They waste so much money in Afghanistan, Iraq, in many wars. As Jimmy Carter told Donald Trump, he said, why China surpassing the United States? Because China spent all the money on development. We spend all the money on weapons, on wars, on destructions. Out of the past 242 years of US history, only 16 years, 1/6 out of 242, the United States was not fighting a war. So this is probably the United States. At the end of the day, it's the military industrial complex of the United States, the part of the capital that's causing deep trouble in the American society, in the United States. I think that's something the United States has to get rid of. Otherwise, I think the country will decline. Now, I try to make a short comparison between China and the United States, but given the time available, so limited time, I will not go into details. Because in my discussion with Western scholars, sometimes we have difficulty in finding definition of democracy. I said, well, let's do by a famous line from Abraham Lincoln, government of the people, by the people, for the people. Let's compare each and every item. I start with for the people. China has been doing much better. I have no time to go into this detail, but I'll leave this data statistics with your school. You can check them. Now, this 91% Chinese think their country on the right direction. It's only about 35% for the United States. Of the people, 95% of Chinese civil servants come from ordinary backgrounds. Compared with the United States, it's very different. And Professor Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, said, the United States today, of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. I agree with Professor Stiglitz 100%. And by the people. Now, that's a key difference. That's to do with our discussion of governance, meritocracy. And my basic argument is if multi-party and universal suffrage means government by the people, then why in the United States have elect and regret all the time? I think multi-party system, universal suffrage, one person, one vote, is what we call a procedural democracy. It's one type of procedural democracy. It's not necessarily substantial democracy or the substance of democracy. So the Chinese explores the substance first. So I argue that we should shift this paradigm from focus on democracy or autocracy to focusing on good governance versus bad governance. That's far more important. Now, here comes the Chinese case. China is a civilizational state, which means it's the amalgamation of a time-honored, continuous, for thousands of years, old civilization with a super large modern state. It has four super large population, super vast territory, a continent, super long traditions. Virtually on everything we have tradition goes back thousands of years, and super rich culture. Another way to express the idea of civilizational state is the amalgamation of hundreds of states into one over its long history. And with that, you can better understand Chinese Communist Party, CPC or CCP. And over the China's long history, China was first unified in 221 BC. And from then on, China has pursued its own course, its own government philosophy and structure. China has been governed by what I call unified ruling entity for over 2,000 years, in most cases. Or you prefer, because the United States like to describe China as a one-party dictatorship, wrong, totally wrong. It is a unified ruling entity for thousands of years. And otherwise the country broke up because the country is an amalgamation of hundreds of states. when we say unified ruling entity, in most cases, Confucian ideology guided ruling entity. What today I would call the Chinese Communist Party as a party of holistic interest political party. The political parties under the Western model in the United States are what I call the partial interest political parties. So for holistic party, we can work for the vast majority of population as a whole. We can make long-term plans. We can carry out reforms. For partial interest party, it's very difficult to carry reform because reforms means overcoming all kinds of vested interests and their obstacles. If you don't have holistic interests and recognized by your people, and then you cannot have difficulty in pushing for meaningful reforms. Then meritocracy. China pursues a vigorous process of what I call selection plus election. Selection is from China's long tradition. This tradition started with the Keju system. China invented public service examination system in China's Sui dynasty, roughly 1,500 years ago. So people have to attend examinations, whatever your family background. You have to pass the examination, and then you can become a senior official, become minister, even become prime minister. Yeah. So in China, long history of many prime ministers coming from very humble background. A saying in China goes, a prime minister has to start with a county chef, and a general had to start with a foot soldier. So this tradition is always there. We call this tradition as selection. And election is something China has learned from the West. So today, China's system, meritocracy, can be called selection plus election. If you look at the criteria for China's top leadership, we have 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Communist Party of China, the top 7 leaders. The minimum requirement in most cases is 2 terms as a governor or number 1 of a Chinese province, which literally means each and every one of them have already managed or governed over 100 million people before they came to their present position as one of the top 7 leaders. General Secretary Xi Jinping has worked for as number 1 of 3 Chinese provinces, including the city of Shanghai and Zhejiang province and Fujian province, has done exceedingly well in all these 3 provinces. So these are the qualifications for governance. So we look at the US, the profile of the US leaders. Indeed, they are, to be honest, way below the Chinese bar. And then we have certain philosophies for political governance. One is called the Mingxing. It's a pun. There is one term called the Mingyi, which means public opinion. Another called the Mingxing, which means hearts and minds of the people. So we make a distinction. In other words, public opinion is important, but public opinion may reflect the hearts and minds of people, may not reflect hearts and minds of people. So at the level of governance, Chinese philosopher Mencius, he's a disciple of Confucius, said there is a difference between Mingxing and Mingyi, public opinion and hearts and minds of people. So to run a country like China, to do it well, run it well, you need to really have governance by Mingxing, by the hearts and minds of people, by the long-term fundamental overall interests of your people, rather than just following public opinion. Sometimes you have to follow, sometimes you have to really make better judgment. And then came the decision-making process. We use the term consultative democracy. It's very important. It depends on the quality of decision. What we have is what we call the neo-democratic centralism. Basically, another phrase to put it is when we want to make a good decision from the people, to the people, one round, to the people, from the people, another round, from the people, to the people, another round. When you go through several rounds of this kind of consultative democracy, you came with a better quality decisions. That's why, when the US launched trade war against China, I said the United States will fail completely. How I came to this conclusion, I studied this American decision-making process under Donald Trump concerning trade war. I think this decision-making process was very rudimentary, elementary by Chinese standards. If you look at the Chinese way of making decisions, take example of 5-year strategic planning. We start with 1.5 years before the first plan finished. And then we have at least one annual People's Congress session to discuss the 5-year plan. Then in November, December, CPC, Party Central Committee, will hold another session discussing Chinese economic planning. So it's annually 5-year term, institutionalized consultations and decision-making process. That's why Chinese economy can do so well compared with many other economies. So this is important. And is the China model an alternative to the Western model? My answer is both yes and no. Let me start with no. China has no messianic tradition. China does not want to convert others. So China never tries to impose its model on other countries. China has no interest whatsoever on that. Second, China is different from other countries because China has a very high degree of political independence. It can make its own decision. It's a big country, it's a big power. It can say no to the United States. This degree of independence, very few other countries can match. And then, as a China civilizational state, in China long history, officials, civil servants were selected through examinations. So it's relatively neutral. The tradition has become more or less like this. The government, in most cases, have trust of the people. And people have trust in the government in both ways. In the sense that the state is playing a kind of disinterested, neutral role rather than on behalf of certain interest groups. So these are the features of the Chinese model, long-term features. They are not easily transferable to other countries. Now, why yes? Because the essence of the China model is a country should endeavor to find its own ways and means for modernization, for prosperity, for development in the light of its own national conditions. As the key message I mentioned just now, a quote from Chairman Deng Xiaoping. Yet, many Chinese ideas, many Chinese practices may inspire other countries. For instance, China pushed this Belt and Road initiative. We did a study, we found that in this BRI, several ideas, Chinese idea and practice are very popular. One is a 5-year plan or 1-year plan or local planning, plan for a municipality, for economic zone, etc. The other is this idea of zones. You have set up a zone in which you have special policies for certain policies, and then they work and whatever, and then experience extend elsewhere, etc. So I think in the end, the China model may usher in a paradigm shift, as I mentioned just now, from Western preference for democracy versus autocracy to my preference or Chinese preference for good governance versus bad governance. Actually, when I say this, in a way, I was feel a bit sad because democracy, this very term, has been, I would say, abused by the West. As a result, especially strongly influenced by the Western media, Western study of political science, sometimes called pseudoscience, whenever people mention governance, they refer to Western style of governance, Western style of democracy. Whenever people mention democracy, most people think of Western style democracy. No, that's the problem. That's why I said I prefer good governance versus bad governance. Yet, if the definition of democracy is open, I'll be more than happy to discuss with any people on the Chinese style democracy. it's working well. I mentioned already consultative democracy. I mentioned the people's democracy. I mentioned this idea of new democratic centralism. All these are important for part of China's success. We can also, to avoid any controversy, we can compare Chinese model, American model, democracy model for the people, by the people, and of the people. We can also, I'm thinking of a Chinese experience, we call it with the people. You have to be with the people. Yeah. Chinese leaders spend many months with the ordinary people, which the Americans don't do that. Yeah. And to the people, you make a decision how to pass this decision to the people. So democracy is a wonderful idea, but how to really make sure a democracy really works for your country. We have to work hard to find our own model of democracy. In other words, if the model of democracy is Western model only, I said, forget it. Let's discuss good governance or bad governance. If it's a American model and it's bad governance, why you need to have this kind of democracy? However, it's open for more discussions. That'll be fantastic. That's something I'll be more than happy to do here, even in this class. So I spend more or less 3/4 of time. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Prof, for that intervention. Thank you very much. We will share the presentation with the colleagues. Just to indicate also that if you go to the chat platform, there is a link there of what we call Mentimeter. We are requesting all the participants to participate in the survey. It's basically an interactive way of challenging some of the issues that are being raised in the conversation by Professor Zhang. Now I'm going to request our respondents. I will start with the Commissioner of SARS. I'll give them 10 minutes each, so they will come back to back, starting with the Commissioner of SARS, followed by DG of DCOC, and then Commissioner of the Public Service Commission. I'll give you 10 minutes each, back to back in your interventions, and then we'll open the conversation for all. Commissioner SARS.
Thank you, Principal, and thank you to the good Professor Zhang for sharing so concisely the basis of China's success, which by all commentators is beyond any doubt, beyond any question. I want to just outline a few of the key principles that were shared, and then leave a few questions that I would like the professor to respond to later. I love the notion of selection plus election as the basis for meritocracy. And quite frankly, it is one of our big challenges in South Africa that we have an election process that is not necessarily linked to any qualification or criteria, but based purely on the voting and therefore very often driven in popularity, or one who has the biggest loudhailer rather than the most competent. So it would be wonderful to get some very practical advice on how we can add to our election process the whole notion of a meritocratic selection basis as well. The outstanding message for me, Professor, is firstly that a developmental state cannot be an ideological position. It has to be a state that is pro-development and capable of delivering that developmental program. So again, how does a young democracy, a young state like South Africa, accelerate its own learning so that it can be, not just as we do aspire to be a developmental state, we still have this gap between being a developmental state and being a capable state. How do we cross that divide? The point about good governance is more important than the form of governance is a point I continually make. And that for me, democracy versus autocracy is actually a hollow narrative because it is meaningless if it is not backed up by competent governance. And I think you make that point. So a few questions that I would also like to add to what I have already said. The one is a bit of a challenge for you, and I would like to hear your comment on it. The whole point about China versus the US as the two big, perceived to be the big powers in the world, how is that good for the world? Because very often the smaller economies either have to choose one, they have to align each other because there's short-term sanctions and other forms of incentives that forces them to align. We have an African proverb that says, when two elephants fight, only the grass gets hurt. Yeah. What is your advice how a small country like South Africa can respond to the China-US debate in a way that furthers and advances our own cause? Then secondly, can you give us some practical ways we are bleeding of corruption, and often state-sponsored corruption, where there are senior civil servants, senior political leaders who co-opt and collude with business people and deprive important resources that could be funding development, is then rather wasted and serves the narrow financial interests of a few. Some advice on that. And then the last question that I would like to pose you is, from a scholarly perspective, obviously you're a disciple of this approach, and I can understand why, but from a scholarly perspective, what would your critique be of China's approach? What is the big 2 or 3 derailers that if China is not mindful of it and build that into the next period ahead of it, could potentially undermine its noble agenda of transforming the lives of people? Let me pause there. And thank you once again for sharing so generously an enjoyable presentation, Professor.
Thank you.
Yes, Prof, you can respond to those. We will take the next one after.
Okay. Well, concerning this practical advice on selection plus election, I remember I was in Kenya, I think 20 years ago. I was being asked with the same question. I said, I'm not sure I can really offer you really very useful advice, as I'm not expert on Kenya. Yet, if I can, I try. I would say if the Chinese approach to be adopted here, it will be something like that. I remember, Kenya has, I think, 6 provinces. You will look at the 6 governors, their performances over the past 4 years, which one was generally accepted as the best. Then you would try to make him the top 1 candidate. So that would be something like the Chinese model. And another approach is whether in your elections, at least say at the initial stage or at a certain stage or before the final stage, say there's 2 remaining whatever candidates, whether you can ask 2 of them or 3 of them to really try out running a state or doing something tangible, let's say within 6 months, to deliver something tangible that people can trust. That will be my advice, really, from an individual who does not know much about Africa, although I was there, many years back. But I think the message is you need to identify people with the qualifications. I think this is important from the Chinese message. Yeah. Concerning how to become a developmental state, in other words, how to have this kind of competence. To be honest, China was at the very beginning learned a lot from Soviet Union. Chinese are good learners. We send hundreds to the Soviet Union. We send about 50,000 students to learn from the Soviet experience. When China began to make its first 5-year plan in 1952, we drafted our own plan. Then we went to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, have advice from the Soviet experts. They laughed at us. They said, well, your plan was idealistic, but that's impossible. How can you produce so many tonnage of steel? How can you build so many railways? You need to have this kind of service, this kind of spare part, this kind of, you don't have that. So it's inconceivable to have to cut down. In other words, we have learned a lot of expertise from other countries, from China. In the past 4 decades, we learned a lot from Japan, from Germany, from the United States, from Singapore, from other countries. So basically, you need to have learned this from those who have experience and gradually develop this competence. Concerning the US, between China and the United States, which one to choose? Actually, the United States wants others to make a choice, either with us or against us, either with the United States or against the United States. That had never been China's position. From Chinese culture, from Chinese tradition, we are always open-minded. You can be friend of China, you can be friend of the United States. We do not force you to choose at all. Even BRI is open to the United States. If US companies prefer to come, most welcome. And in the Chinese philosophy, every country is a friend or potential friend. If at this particular moment we have problems, yet in the end, we can become friends. So we are much more broad-minded than the Americans, really, to be honest. And as for fighting corruption, and this is a challenge for most countries, for many countries, even for many Western countries, for the United States as well. Usually in the fast pace of development, corruption also goes up. And then if you cannot control the corruption, your process of development will be derailed. There are many such cases in history. So usually after rapid development, then you can bring the corruption under control. Then your system will work better and better. And in many ways, Chinese leader Xi Jinping had done that. China's corruption went up in the first 3 decades. And in the last decades, Xi Jinping fought really ferociously with disciplines, with punishment against corrupt officials. So corruption goes down sharply in China. Most people think we can have a clean government. So that's important. But this is a process. You always need to have leaders and determined who can take tough decisions. Yeah, so that's important. As for future challenges for China, there are quite many. But the point is, it's as with every country. For instance, today, a major challenge is this green economy. We have to really reduce a lot of production in order to ensure our environment being better protected. There are many, but there are ways and means to deal with these challenges. On that, we are optimistic. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
DG, Avril, it's now your turn.
Okay, firstly, I want to really say thank you so much to the professor, in sharing with us the successes of China. It's really great to hear you speak about the experience of China. and in particular, as it would relate to the civilizational state and the meritocracy. And for me, really just building that capable state of China. So the rise of China is really, for me, also admirable, and it does leave one inspired. And like you had earlier stated, you had said that you use a selective approach when you, as China would borrow culturally from other countries. I'd like to also then use this opportunity for you to tell us what are some of those things that we could borrow from China, as an infant country. I mean, we are only 27 years into our own democracy, and I strongly believe that we should be finding our own model of democracy as well. So my first question to you would then be, so what can South Africa be offered practically in terms of transforming the hearts and minds of our people on a developmental approach which is actually anchored on good governance? And following through on that, in finding our own model of democracy, what are some of the key points that we should be considering in South Africa? Especially if we take into account where we are as a country economically, and really how it is that we not only just begin to address the issues or the triple challenge that we have around poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So if you could just give us some of those practical points that we could look at, with immediacy around those challenges. And I also then do strongly agree that you spoke to the gradual reform of the changes that we also want to bring in when we consider our own model, democratic model, and really taking into account the fact that people matter. And you've put it as a people-centered developmental approach, and taking into account the pressing needs of the people. And you use this whole 5-year strategic plan where you would make decisions, but those decisions would then really involve the people. I wanted to hear just a little bit more of that approach and how is it that you undertake it. And thank you so much. You really got me so excited and inspired. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you. If we perhaps again go back to this idea of developmental state, your question also had to do with that. And some Chinese experience will be more or less like this, if you look at the role of the Chinese Communist Party, one major credit we give to the party is its competence in getting the people organized. I think that's really crucial. And, Chinese Communist movement or Chinese Revolution was an indigenous movement inspired by the Soviet Union, by Lenin. Yet the party went through different ways and means and suffered badly on its way. Yet in the end, we give credit to Chairman Mao. He said we should not copy the Soviet experience. The Soviet Union was to organize uprisings in the cities. For the case of China, it's a vast country. 95% people at that time were peasants. So Chairman Mao said we should go to the countryside to get the peasants organized. At that time, it was to organize Chinese peasants for China's revolution, for the war against Japanese, for the war against KMT, the nationalist government. But in the end, this is also a way, when we look at this from today's perspective, how the Chinese society got organized. I was in Africa in the past on many occasions. I noticed the state, the central government the power of central government cannot, in many cases, reach the grassroots. In the case of China, through the peasant movement organized by Chairman Mao, he organized peasants' associations, peasants' cooperatives to support the Chinese Red Army. In the end, they became the grassroots institution units for agricultural production. So Chinese society, from the very the really grassroots, they became organized. So even not today, say 1 decade, 2 decades ago, if we want to provide, say, relief or subsidies to Chinese peasant or family or household in the mountainous area, we can only do that through, banking system. In other words, the society institutionalized, organized. So the directions from the central government can reach the bottom of the society. And that's part of the state capacity for developmental state. And in the case of China, as a practical advice, maybe for our African friends, is how to get ordinary people, grassroots, organized. And that will be really very meaningful for modernization, for plan. Essentially, modernization means get each and everyone mobilized to work for his own interest and for the interest of his country. So that's important. So get organized is an important message. And yes, you mentioned this 5-year plan. I can tell you with slight detail how it was made. We have an institution which is called the State Commission for Reform and Development, which is not only at the level of central government, but also at the level of provincial government, municipality government. So in most cases, a 5-year plan began to take shape from the very beginning. That was 1.5 years before the last 5-year plan was finished. Then it involves this State Reform and Development Commission. They will produce a draft of the draft. Then they will distribute the draft to different think tanks, to different institutions. We have an organized structure of consultative democracy. So basically, it's within the Communist Party of China, outside the Communist Party of China, within the think tanks and outside think tanks. They have all kinds of what we call how to translate, roughly connection points. In other words, because China is a vast country, 1.4 billion people, so you cannot have each one, everyone, but you do have a certain, for instance, you are going to formulate one part of the 5-year plan. It has to do with intellectual property protection. So that was more or less with, you will contact certain think tanks, and then you will reach people who are using this right. So for instance, in Shanghai, we have one neighborhood, which is about 100,000 residents, ordinary people, one huge neighborhood. They are the connection point of the People's Congress. So when there is a plan concerning a certain, say, protection of women's rights, they will put this directly from Beijing to this particular neighborhood. They have about 10 connection points, and then they will have feedback on the issues from different feedback connection points. And then, of course, make a decision, what we call from the people to the people. Yeah. And then because economy, after all, is the most important thing in modernization, in development. People depend on development of the economy. So not only 5-year plans are made every 5 years, within 5-year plan, they also have an annual plan, 1 year for each of these 5 years. And then the 5-year plan, not only at the national level, but also at the provincial level and the municipality level. So they are all more or less in harmony with each other. The key point is these plans are not Soviet-type plans. Soviet-type plan is, from today's point of view, we think really rudimentary. It's not working. You cannot plan how many shoes people are going to wear. You cannot plan, how many cigarettes people will consume. No, that's unrealistic. Yet you can make strategic planning, which provides sense of direction. For instance, whether AI technology will be China's priority or not, whether blockchain technology will be China's priority or not. So these are the strategic indicative planning, not mandatory planning as the Soviet model. So this is important. And furthermore, this kind of planning itself, because in China, this planning process has become institutionalized. As a result, planning itself generates demand, and demand generates economic development. In the case of Shanghai, for instance, you ask any Shanghainese, they will know 3 years from now or 5 years from now, there will be a metro line, and there will be a station there, a station here. And then the real estate price will change. So all this is something, people are concerned with. So indeed, in the case of Chinese experience, this planning is already part of the Chinese both public life and in many ways private life. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Prof. Somato Dafigeni, Commissioner of the Public Service Commission.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for such an insightful presentation on Chinese pragmatic approach as such. And we envy China in many ways when we see the indicators. I'll just start by saying this lecture indeed is trying to say culture and heritage matters. And as such, you have illustrated that by saying you do have this civilization over thousands of years. How would you then advise a young democracy like ours, which is experiencing acute plurality, which is fragmented, different civilizations contesting for the space? So that is one thing. I'm mindful of the context and the fact that it's not one size fits all. And the second point that you raised, which I think is of interest to us, whenever we talk of democracy, the emphasis is always on the first generation rights. Do you have freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of expression, and so forth? But we hardly ever talk of the second generation rights, which I think is what you are emphasizing, the material conditions of people in terms of poverty, employment, in terms of all those other things, which in essence sometimes do determine whether people can meaningfully participate in a democracy or not. Because if you have such vast discrepancies and inequalities, such rights become rights only in name because you do not have the means to even participate. I just have this one question. As China evolved into a superpower status, into a leading economic giant, and also militarily also having to expand, how will it handle that power outside China, because that's what matters the most. We have experienced the Western hegemonic, imperial, and sometimes military-based approach. And more recently, more dramatically, it has not worked, as you have seen in the Middle East, and you have seen in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and so forth. It is more capable in winning wars and not capable in winning peace and reconstruction in that sense. So that's the first thing. And in that sense, will China use cultural diplomacy as well, and an extension of cultural, influence into other areas where they happen to make their presence? The second big issue that I want to ask, given the COVID-19, the fourth industrial revolution, the current geopolitical shifts, climate change, you name them, are we entering a new world order on a scale which is the same as we saw post-Second World War? If so, what are the early indications of what it will look like so that we can locate ourselves within that system? And the next one in the range of questions, in terms of the trade laws and many other global, prescripts, what is China's experience, because it operated outside the World Trade Organization for some time, and it operated from outside some of the institutions for some time. And now that it is in a stronger position, it seemed to have joined and participated actively. And you see the same case with the British Industrial Revolution, with the American. Most of the policies and the trade laws were not applicable, but once they were in a powerful position, it was easier for them to dictate, because they were there in the formulation of those rules. But whilst they were evolving, they didn't necessarily follow those prescripts. And the last one I want to raise, which country has successfully copied Chinese model? Because you've spoken much about what China has done. And we know for a fact that Fukuyama was talking about the end of history because the socialist bloc had collapsed symbolically with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And you mentioned the end of history. And what is there in the post-end of the end of history? Because even the third way that the Tony Blairs tried seem not to have taken off. But all we know is that globalization system as we speak has not been inclusive and has had many weaknesses. Hence, only 1% of the wealthiest seem to be gaining more from it, and so forth. So that, to me, I think would be some of the key issues. I would have had, if we had time, spoken to the issue of planning and implementation, because South Africa is not lacking in terms of developing policies. In fact, sometimes we overdevelop policies and we let them die before we even see their maturity. But the planning and the implementation to see the impact seems to be the major problem. But at times we seem to be treasury driven, where we say, is money available for this or not, rather than being a strategy driven on a long term, where you have shifts when your priorities shift. So I would like to get your reflection on some of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I share many of your views on these issues. Let me start with your question concerning to what extent China will use its military power. China is on the whole a very peaceful country in many ways, in the sense that if you compare China history with history of Europe, European history was marked by military conquest. If you look at the industrial revolutions taking place in Europe, the first industrial revolution in the UK, then, Americas became colonies. Slaves were sent from Africa to Americas. The second industrial revolution in the 19th century, scramble for Africa. So by the Berlin Conference, I think 1890 something, Africa was completely divided between European powers. China is indeed remarkable in the sense that it has achieved this kind of dramatic rise without firing a single shot, without war and blood, without military concurrence. When United States became the world's largest economy in 1895 something, the US began to launch war against Spain and took the Philippines and Cuba and other islands. China became the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity in 2014. But China, in theory, China can, settle these territorial disputes, say, in the South China Sea by force. Chinese Navy can take all the islands back, perhaps within 48 hours. But we don't do that. We prefer negotiated settlement. All the neighbors are friends or potential friends. We think we can settle these disputes peacefully. And when just exploded its nuclear device in 1964, China declared that it will never be the first to use nuclear weapons. It will never be the one that used nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. So in many ways, China is a different type of superpower, if you prefer to use this term. It's really, for the first time in human history, we have a largest economy, which indeed peace-loving, but with a very powerful defense capability, because we suffered so much for 100 years. We were invaded by European powers, by other powers, by Japan. So we share the same kind of experience, historic experience with African countries. You were colonies of European powers. We were semi-colonies of the European powers. So that kind of memory reminds us that you have to have a powerful defense capability and to defend your core interest. On that, we're also very tough. The Cold War was cold in Europe, but the Cold War was hot in Asia. They evolved to larger scale military confrontation between China and the United States in the Korean battlefield, in the Vietnam battlefield. And the United States lost both wars. So we constantly remind the United States, be very cautious, do not step into the red line of China's core interests. And this is very important. So we maintain our very powerful ability to say no to the United States, to this kind of superpower. You have to respect our sovereignty, and we are on equal terms. So in other words, from the interest of other countries, I think the rise of China is indeed, having myself traveled over 100 countries, I think, China pursued this principle of win-win and peaceful cooperation. So this is really a bonus for international community, for mankind, I think. When the Western countries accuse China of practicing colonialism in Africa, I think it's ridiculous. I think African countries know this far better because they experienced colonialism. When British was ruling Africa, you travel from, say, Ghana in West Africa to Kenya in East Africa, you have to go via London. Yeah. But China is building infrastructures from air links, transport links, railways within Africa to help African countries linking each other. So this is not colonial powers will do. This is a Chinese approach. We think China has experienced that within China. When we build better infrastructure, the country will prosper. So this is some China will be very different. Now, new global order. I think, given the scale of change, indeed, if in the past, there'll be a lot of wars, whether it's with, I said, within each industrial revolution, there will be a war and wars. But today, the typical feature is the decline of the West and the rise of the rest, and notably China. I think this is an important force for peace, for maintaining peace. Because Chinese always prefer, our slogan is peace and development. Colonial powers approach is what they call the divide and rule. They want to really sow discord among the people, among the countries. The Chinese approach is unite and prosper. So we reject divide and rule. We prefer unite and prosper. Hopefully, with the rise of China, this will become the consensus of the international community. And as for the future of the world, I think with this COVID-19 pandemic, the overall trend towards a kind of socialist inclination will be stronger and stronger. In other words, virtually in all societies, the role of the state will become is becoming bigger and bigger, whether in the West, in China, or in Africa. So I think in the coming years and decades, how to make the state function better will be crucial for the success of that country and for the success of the whole international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. That was a great encounter. I'm going to ask 4 colleagues to speak, and I don't want them to ask questions necessarily. I want them to go back to the theme of this conversation around the civilizational state and meritocratic bureaucracies. And so, in a sense, they could, on the basis of what they've heard, localize this and challenge us here as South Africans about what are the practical steps. And I'll give them 3 minutes each, and I'll go back to Prof. Zhang to then, summarize the conversation. So I'm not asking the colleagues to ask him questions, but I'm giving you an opportunity to help us here answer the questions, what is to be done. So I will ask them in this particular order, so they will follow each other, 3 minutes each. It's Mtimka, Lehotla, Nkoli, and Lubisi. So in that order, Mtimka, Lehotla, Nkoli, and Lubisi. Please, you've got 3 minutes because we are ending at 2 as we had promised. Ongama. We want practical suggestions. What do you think ought to be done on the basis of the intervention we've had today? Okay, he's not responding. Papi, are you there? Papi, can you hear me? Okay, let's go to Pali Lehotla, the former Station General.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Principal, for the opportunity. Thanks, Professor Wiwi. Two issues that I would like just to raise that I think are important probably for South Africa. How did you use the purchasing power parity information from the International Comparisons Program, which you had refused to accept in 2014, China being the biggest economy, to look inward around your strategy of domestic consumption. And how would South Africa, for instance, I think I would look at domestic consumption as a driver of growth. That's the first question. The second question is around your strategy on population. In 2011, I was in China. 2012, I was in China to look at the economic implications on the demography of China.
Mm-hmm.
And in that discussions, there were 3 resolutions, amongst which was domestic consumption, relaxing the bedroom to 2 children. Now we have expanded that to 3. What is South Africa to learn from that? The last question is around long-term planning. And you've touched on this quite extensively, and it's been my worry all the time around South Africa as to how do we manage a long-term planning. What kind of tools can we put in place to marshal, discussion around planning and engage society?
Okay.
So there are a bit of questions, but yeah, thanks.
Thanks, SG. Ongama.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to Prof. Really great presentation. I think it's good to hear an insider perspective of the Chinese model. It's good to hear about the meritocracy as well as the democratic nature of what otherwise we've characterized, perhaps wrongly, simply as a one-party state. So I think it's good. And I think that it comes at a time when, as a world, we're looking for, it's time we became open to new models and new solutions. But I quite liked the epistemic humility in your presentation of the Chinese model, especially the recognition of both its potential, but also its limitedness as far as it can be exported to the rest of the world, because I think that underlies the spirit of lack of cultural, supremacist thinking. So I think it makes sense, and it allows to be listened to in this sense. But I think that also what was a takeaway for me in your presentation is the fact that you recognize and this is in line with comparative politics thinking, the recognition of the path dependency of political economic systems, and how, as Prof. Fiken was saying it earlier on, the specific situation of a specific country, be it its culture and language, is important in designing its own political economic systems. So, and I think that was affirmative from my end, because I'm also one of the people who believe very strongly in being inspired by the thinking and the experience of others, but to ground that in own experience to the extent that the outcome of in terms of policy outcome, is greater than the singular inspiration of the outside world or the determination of inside dynamics. So I think for me that was a key one. It's inviting others, your input, it's inviting others to explore what may work for them given their contexts without losing out on the inspiration of others. So, but the vital question for me is moving from, because currently the South African political economic system is facing a crisis, in terms of which we are recognizing that the democracy in the way that it has been is not working to the extent that the state might prosper despite the political order. And it's going to be interesting how we move from here to a political economic order that works. I personally am working currently on a paper that is looking at alternative political institution building from isiXhosa language. And I hope that, and you've inspired me enough to explore further while recognizing the inspiration of the outside world. So thank you, Prof.
Thank you there. Let me go to Papi. Papi Nkoli, then we will end with DG Lubisi. Papi?
Thank you very much, Principal. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you to Prof. Zhang Weiwei as well. Mine actually in two parts. I've learned recently that I've actually learned recently from the from some material that since from the 10th century onwards, China has continuously been perfecting its own community level participatory bureaucratic structures that are otherwise known as Baojias. In South Africa, we have something equivalent to that, which are street committees and village committees. What kind of lessons can we learn from China that we can incorporate into our own structures as a state in the development of the capable state in South Africa? That's the first part. The second one relates to the historical development of the capable state per se within the mode of view of the civilizational state. Inevitably, it has been viewed that usually towards pursuing civilization, we need. These states have had to pursue imperialism. So, now is the Chinese assertiveness in terms of its foreign policy not falling within that imperialistic continuum of the capable state? Thank you.
Thank you, DG Lubisi.
Thank you very much, Principal, and thank you to Professor Zhang for an extremely inspirational masterclass. Let me say that Professor Zhang's masterclass today has kind of opened a theoretical Pandora box for me, which I'm not sure that I can resolve at this stage, but it raises certain questions which I think one has to think about individually and as a country going forward, because it says to me what Professor Zhang is saying is that the South African state, from what I can discern from what he's saying, the South African state would clearly needs a new basis for its legitimacy. We come from a situation where largely the South African state, through its legitimacy from its ideological basis, as led by a liberation movement that led the freedom of the people of this country from the chains of apartheid colonialism. However, that has, over the past 28 or so years, been changing to something different. And what we can see from the recent mass stay-away in the local government elections, recent local government elections, seems to suggest that indeed we do need a new basis for the legitimacy of the South African state. And often, if you look at the media during this period, what they were showing is appalling conditions under which our people are living in some of the localities, uncollected garbage, issues around proper provision of water, sanitation, and electricity, issues around repair and maintenance of basic public infrastructure. It appears that the basis for legitimacy, as Professor Zhang is saying, is actually shifting. It's shifted from ideology to concrete governance for the people. We're shifting from form to substance. And that raises all sorts of questions for us. And I started thinking around Marxist-Leninist theories of the withering away of the state, to start thinking about, are we to revise our notion of the withering away of the state to the withering away of the state as an instrument of class rule? So these issues then say that we have to now seriously take concretely what it means to transform the state as an instrument in the pursuit of the popular interest of the people. And again, here, it takes us back to the question, who are the people? And what are the collective interests of those people? And could this mean, and that's what Ongama was saying, could this mean we have to reconsider how the people are organized in pursuit of their own interests? And these are fundamental questions that we as a country should begin to look at now, which of course necessarily throws us ironically back to ideological questions, because our current systems of organization are based on neocolonialism and neoliberalism, whether we like it or not, as the dominant system under which we live on this side of our shores. Finally, Busani, when we talk to this issue of what the collective interests of our people are, it talks right back to what we've been talking about since 2011, when we developed the National Development Plan, that we need a social compact. What are the elements of that social compact? We need the minimum elements. What are the minimum elements? And we need to have a clear trajectory in pursuit of those national consensus on the minimum elements, to say, how do we best move forward? It's a difficult situation in our country, of course, because of the manner in which the people are organized in pursuit of their own interests. The political party system that we have, and the general short-termism that we in our country are accustomed to. I've been listening carefully to Professor Zhang, who speaks to what I know. The Chinese think in thousands of years. They don't think in 5 years. The 5 years are just small little drops in a 1,000-year trajectory. And that's one of the things that, in my view, we, from a political perspective, need to begin to look at. Let me stop there at this stage. This thing, as I said, it's opened a theoretical Pandora box in my mind, which I will try to make sense of in the next few months. Thank you very much.
Thanks, DG. Well, Prof. Zhang, there you are. So you can make your intervention and summarize, as you did argue. Currently, they say President Xi speaks of a shared community of humankind. I suppose that includes sharing of ideas, which is what this session is about. So your summary and your parting shots, and what is this one big advice that you will give to us as leaders of a bureaucracy in South Africa?
Well, perhaps having heard the so many comments, I will just make 2 brief points. We had to do with Chinese experience, which may be helpful for our South African friends. One is, as some of you mentioned, even in South Africa, you are thinking of a kind of new social contract, a kind of new way for legitimacy. Maybe the Chinese approach is, in a way, interesting, because we think it's not that complicated to know what exactly most people want. You ask a few, credible opinion survey institutions. and try to find what are the key issues which we have to handle. I just assume, in fact, in most countries, developing countries in particular, it's about fighting poverty. It's about fighting disease. It's about job creation. It's about street safety. And you just do this accordingly, in terms of priority, one by one. That's the basics of Chinese model. Each year we have a do list. We'll do this, this, this. You make a promise, and then the National People's Congress, you will say, yes, over the past 12 months, we finished this. So the Chinese model is based on kind of can-do spirit and very pragmatic. We find problems and we have a do list, and we solve them one by one. That's how you achieve credible legitimacy. We call performance legitimacy. That's my first point. The second point is the Chinese model is very different from the other types of democracy. That is, we have this democratic centralism. In other words, political process or democracy itself cannot simply be just a talking shop, a coffee shop where people drink coffee and talk. No, that's for European aristocracy. It must be something, you can have full discussion as wide as possible. At the same time, you must be able to reach consensus. And then on this consensus, we can work together and push the nation forward. And I was discussing with my American friends last week. I said, he said, why you don't have opposition party? I said, if you look at Chinese Communist Party, within the party itself, we always have all kinds of voices. We have very free-flowing discussions. But in the end, we reach certain consensus. And on this consensus, we work. If there are only democracy and no decision to work, or there are no way to work on consensus, then this democracy is of poor quality. The Chinese experience is, yes, we should have democratic discussions, but we should also have democratic decision. And once decision made, we work on that. And in the process of working on decisions, we try to have feedback to see whether this is pursued as we want, or whether we have made certain mistakes. In the process, we make small modification to make sure that in the end, the purpose will be more positive than negative. So if you look at the results of China 5-year plans, now we have already finished 13 5-year plans. And most cases, they are fulfilled ahead of the time, ahead of the 5 years, so over-fulfilled the plan. So when you make certain plans, you have democracy, you have discussions, consultations, then reach a decision, and then work on the plans. That's important. Otherwise, it's always slightly regrettable. Okay, I will just say this for your reference, for your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Wonderful to have you once again. So whilst this conversation was taking place, we ran a short survey. You'll remember that I put this question to you and others earlier on, that in your own conversation with your colleague and friend Kishore, said China succeeds because of government, India succeeds in spite of government. So regardless of what government does, Indian society or Indian people tend to move forward. And the question is, what about South Africa? I guess the challenge for us as people who lead the public sector will be such that in the next few years, people are able to answer this question in the affirmative and say South Africa succeeds because of government. But you cannot do that if the state is weak. We asked the participants here a question whether meritocracy is a silver bullet. Many people said yes. I guess having been convinced by yourself, Prof, they thought that meritocracy matters and that it will go a long way in strengthening the capacity, the issues of legitimacy and dealing with the service delivery and growth. We also asked the question whether elected officials, those who hold political office and those who are heading departments like ourselves, whether they can lead a renaissance. And majority of people said yes. This is crucial because it means people recognize that there is a power and authority that resides among those who lead the state, and that they are the ones who need to be actually championing a renaissance. And lastly, what do we take? What does it take for societies to rapidly transform? As you can see there in the word cloud, everybody said leadership, which speaks to the issues that you raised there, Prof. So thank you very much once again. Let me ask my colleague, Lakela Kaunda, to do a vote of thanks and close.
Thank you very much. What is going on? Thank you very much, Prof. Ngaweni. And thank you very much. What is happening to my video? Thank you very much to everyone for such a stimulating discussion. We really appreciate the opportunity to have. We always, as the NSG, want to hold these thought leadership sessions from time to time in order to take forward the vision of building a capable state, an ethical developmental state. The public service is a very pivotal role of building a functional state that will help this country to achieve the goals of making South Africans happy. I attended one course on governance in China, and I was told that the simple purpose of government and purpose of the state is to make the people happy. I thought it was the simplest definition I've ever heard. So thank you, Prof. Sang, for joining us as we share ideas and perspectives with regards to taking that mission forward. We thank all our panelists. There's 18 of them. You have heard some of them speak, but there's much more. There's also our ambassadors who have joined us from like China, Ambassador Siyabonga Cwele, there's Ambassador Mpashwa. Thank all our participants as well. We really appreciate the fact that you made the time. The Chinese government model, as you said, Prof. Sang, there's a lot of lessons that we can draw as South Africa. There's a lot of work that we still need to do to build our country, taking our mission forward, given the fact that we have so many challenges that we still face, which were outlined so eloquently by Dr. Lulisi. So we really appreciate this intellectual discussion, this discussion that is assisting us to move forward. That being said, we thank you, Prof. Ngaweni, as well. We've had a lot of these sessions and we want to continue having as many as possible because, as you are saying, Prof. Sang, building a developmental state cannot be a once-off event. It took thousands of years. It will still take us many more years to get where we want to be, but we are convinced that with the kind of vision that our country has, we will be able to move forward. So we thank you very much for the session.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. And we look forward to more intellectual discussions and stimulating discussions in the future to move our country forward. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And goodbye, Prof. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, DG.
Thank you, Basani.